They told him to know his place. Western diplomats smiled in his face, shook his hand for the cameras, then called him a temporary problem behind closed doors. Israeli intelligence? They didn't even bother hiding their smirk, like a young African captain could never touch them. But last Thursday, Ibrahim Traoré touched everything. In less than 6 hours, he ripped out the wires of a surveillance empire stretching from Lagos to Nairobi. And the best part? The people who've been spying on Africa for decades didn't see it coming. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't think they had to. Now the champagne glasses in Brussels are shaking. Washington is pretending not to notice. And Paris? Let's just say they're suddenly talking about African partnerships, like they invented the idea. But here's the uncomfortable truth. One young leader just proved that the power games they've played here for generations aren't bulletproof anymore. You think last Thursday's raids came out of nowhere? Let's rewind. In 2011, an Israeli cyber intelligence firm called NSO Group quietly began operations in West Africa, pitching security solutions to governments from Nigeria to Côte d'Ivoire. By 2015, they had partnered with at least 7 telecom providers across the continent, installing monitoring equipment for anti-terror purposes. At least that's what the brochures said. Burkina Faso officially signed a $42 million technology deal in 2017 with a consortium that included an Israeli satellite imaging company. Publicly, it was to improve agricultural mapping. Privately, according to documents I've seen, it also gave them access to geospatial data on mineral-rich zones in the Sahel. Within 2 years, 3 foreign mining companies had secured exclusive rights in exactly those mapped areas. Coincidence? You tell me. Traoré's team had been tracking this for months. On July 14th this year, Burkina Faso's internal security intercepted an encrypted call between a corporate executive in Tel Aviv and a consultant in Abidjan. The call transcript, later verified by 2 intelligence analysts, contained discussions about Phase 3 asset targeting and sensitive partner profiles, terms common in espionage circles. And this wasn't just Israel. A leaked 2022 African Union cybersecurity report, never published publicly, identified cross-sharing of surveillance data between Israeli, French, and British contractors operating in at least 5 African capitals. The report estimated over 2.6 million citizens' personal data had been stored on servers outside the continent without consent. Now, let's flip the script for my American viewers. Imagine the headlines if a foreign network had been mapping oil reserves in Texas, listening to calls from state governors, and quietly selling that intel to rival corporations in Shanghai or Moscow. Would CNN call it economic cooperation, or would the FBI be all over it by Monday morning? That's the reality Traoré was staring at. 15 years of so-called development partnerships that looked less like cooperation and more like digital colonialism. And maybe that's why he decided it was time to stop playing diplomat and start playing defense. Here's where the story shifts from whispers in backrooms to boots on the ground. On Thursday, October 26th, at exactly 5:02 a.m., Ibrahim Traoré made the call that his advisors had warned him not to make, greenlighting what military planners codenamed Operation Clear Sight. The order was simple but lethal. No leaks, no delays, no mercy. By 7 o'clock a.m., while most of Ouagadougou was still half asleep, 412 soldiers from the Presidential Guard, supported by the 25th Paratrooper Regiment, moved on 17 separate targets across the capital. The first hit was on the eastern edge of the city, a shiny glass-fronted telecommunications building registered to a company called Sahel Com Technologies. Publicly, it was known for offering affordable 4G services. Privately, according to security files, it housed a server farm capable of monitoring 60% of all mobile traffic in Burkina Faso. Inside, soldiers found racks of high-capacity data storage, encrypted satellite phones with direct dialing codes to Tel Aviv, and an internal memo dated August 3rd referring to asset relocation before transition. That last phrase caught everyone's eye. Transition to what? The evidence was flown straight to the National Security Archive for analysis. And here's the twist. Sahelcom Technologies wasn't operating alone. At 8:15 a.m., a parallel raid on a nondescript NGO office in the Central Business District uncovered facial recognition databases tied to Clearview AI, a controversial U.S.-based company already under investigation in several countries for scraping biometric data without consent. Those systems were configured to send backup logs to a secure server in Marseille, France. Now, I know my American viewers might be thinking, wait, Clearview, that's one of ours. And you'd be right. Which is why this gets awkward fast. If Burkina Faso was hosting Chinese surveillance servers, Washington would be the first to sound the alarm. But when the hardware points back to American and European partners, suddenly the tone shifts to, let's talk about this quietly. By 9:30 a.m., 6 other sites had been hit, each showing the same pattern. Development groups and tech companies on the surface, covert intelligence gathering underneath. The last target, rated at 10:12 a.m., turned out to be the local office of a mining consultancy tied to 3 offshore entities in Luxembourg. Guess which mining concessions they had secured in the past 18 months? Exactly the ones flagged in Traoré's intelligence folder. This was no random sweep. It was a surgical dismantling of a network the West assumed was untouchable. And maybe that's what stings the most. They didn't just lose access, they lost the illusion of control. By noon, the phone lines in Ouagadougou were buzzing like a switchboard in a war movie. The first call came from Bamako. Mali's interim president didn't bother with pleasantries, just said, "We've got the same thing here. What's your playbook?" Traoré's answer was as blunt as it gets. "Shut it down. All of it." Within 24 hours, 3 West African countries, Mali, Guinea, and Niger, had either frozen or seized foreign-owned telecom equipment. In Mali, security forces raided the offices of Sahel Data Solutions, a company that had advised several government ministries on digital modernization. Turns out, they were running software licensed from Circles, an Israeli surveillance firm exposed back in 2020 for exploiting mobile networks in more than 25 countries. By Friday morning, the ripple was reaching the coast. In Freetown, Sierra Leone's communications regulator ordered an emergency audit of every foreign-backed telecom project. Ghana's parliament held a closed-door session on digital sovereignty, marking the first time that phrase had even appeared in their official records. Here's the twist the Western press buried on page 12. Intelligence intercepts from the Burkina raids suggested coordination between Israeli contractors and the UK's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, the same agency that's part of the Five Eyes alliance with the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. For decades, this group has been painted as the good guys in the global surveillance narrative. Now, their fingerprints were all over African telecom infrastructure. And let's not kid ourselves. If this exact setup were uncovered in Florida or California with Chinese or Russian tags, you'd see 24/7 coverage on CNN, Fox, MSNBC, you name it. There'd be panels, Senate hearings, task forces. But because the servers traced back to London, Tel Aviv, and yes, Virginia, the official line from Washington was the classic. "We are reviewing the matter and remain committed to our partnerships in the region." Translation: "We're not going to talk about it unless you force us." By the end of that week, the African Union Cybersecurity Working Group had scheduled an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. Sources inside the AU told me it was the first time multiple heads of state were seriously discussing a continent-wide policy to block undeclared foreign intelligence activities. If that sounds like a big deal, it is. For years, the default playbook was to quietly work around the problem. Traoré had just flipped the board. By the following Monday, Traoré wasn't just reacting, he was rewriting the rules. On October 30th, he stood before a closed-door session of 6 West African leaders in Ouagadougou and laid out what he called the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. The core principle was as plain as it was provocative. African data stays in Africa, unless African governments explicitly say otherwise. This wasn't some vague political statement. The draft document, which I've reviewed, had teeth. Full transparency for all foreign investment in telecom and data infrastructure. Mandatory African-led audits of any company handling citizen information. Zero tolerance for undeclared intelligence activities. A joint rapid response unit to shut down violations within 48 hours. And here's the line that really rattled Western capitals. What affects one African nation's digital sovereignty affects all of us. That's collective defense language, the kind you hear in NATO treaties, not African telecom policy. The facts hit hard. Within 72 hours of the raids, Burkina Faso had already received offers from Russia's Rostelecom, India's Tech Mahindra, and yes, even some European firms willing to operate under full audit conditions. Meanwhile, several Israeli companies that once dominated African contracts suddenly found themselves blacklisted. Not by political decree, but by a new compliance checklist they refused to meet. Now, if you're in the US, this might feel uncomfortably familiar. Remember the uproar over Huawei building 5G networks? Washington's argument was simple. We can't trust foreign-controlled infrastructure to handle our data. Well, guess what? Africa just made the same argument. Only this time, the foreigners in question are America's friends. And maybe that's the real controversy here. When Washington blocks Chinese tech, it's called national security. When Burkina Faso blocks Western tech, it gets labeled as destabilizing partnerships. You see the double standard? By the time the meeting ended in Ouagadougou, the 6 leaders had agreed to push the framework at the next African Union summit. Traoré walked out flanked by his counterparts, not as the isolated young captain the Western press liked to caricature, but as the guy who had just given Africa its first serious blueprint for digital independence. It didn't take long for the shockwaves to cross borders. By November 10th, just 2 weeks after Operation Clear Sight, Morocco's parliament passed an emergency bill restricting all foreign data collection to servers physically located inside the country. In Kenya, the Ministry of ICT ordered a full audit of every international telecom partnership signed in the last 10 years. Nigeria's Communications Authority went further, mandating that all cloud providers serving Nigerian users must establish in-country data centers by 2025. And then came the real curveball: South Africa. Normally, Pretoria plays it safe, avoiding moves that might upset its Western trade partners. But on November 22nd, their Department of Communications declared that African digital infrastructure should primarily serve African interests. The wording was almost identical to a line from Traoré's framework, proof that the idea was spreading faster than even he expected. Here's the twist that made some Western diplomats choke on their canapés. These policies weren't just popping up in Africa. In early December, Malaysia announced a data sovereignty review, citing Burkina Faso's actions as a precedent. In Latin America, Bolivia's government floated a proposal to join a Global South Digital Alliance modeled on the Ouagadougou framework. Even in Europe, a handful of smaller states, Serbia for one, began marketing themselves as digital sovereignty compliant to attract investment from countries wary of surveillance capitalism. Now, to my American viewers, here's the awkward part. U.S. tech giants have spent years warning about data localization laws overseas, arguing they slow innovation. But when those same laws are passed in states like California to protect American consumers, they're praised as forward-thinking. See the pattern? What's good for you is security. But when Africa does it, suddenly it's protectionism. By mid-December, it was clear this wasn't just an African story anymore. The global conversation had shifted, and Traoré had accidentally, or maybe deliberately, become one of its loudest catalysts. Whether you agree with his politics or not, you can't deny this. A young leader from Burkina Faso had managed to move the needle on an issue the United Nations has been politely debating for years without results. 6 months after those pre-dawn raids, the numbers tell a story Western pundits don't want to print. Burkina Faso's internet speeds? Up 27%, according to independent tests by Ookla. Average telecom costs for consumers? Down by nearly a third. And here's the kicker. Foreign investment in the tech sector hasn't vanished. It's shifted. Contracts once dominated by companies from Tel Aviv, Paris, and Washington are now being signed with partners in Mumbai, Sao Paulo, and even a few European firms willing to play by the new transparency rules. Of course, critics in the West still call it reckless. They say Traoré's stance will scare away innovation. Funny! They said the same thing about India's data protection laws in 2011, and now every US tech company is bending over backwards to comply with them. Seems reckless is just the word they use when someone else starts setting the rules. And let's be real, this isn't about hating the West. Traoré himself has said it. We welcome any partner who respects our sovereignty. The problem is, too many foreign players have gotten used to assuming African consent without asking for it. That era might just be ending. For my American viewers, I'll leave you with this question. If a small country in West Africa can take back control of its data and still grow its digital economy, what's stopping others from doing the same? And when they do, will Washington treat them as equals or as threats to be managed? So here's the challenge. To every leader watching, whether in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, the age of quiet digital colonialism is closing. The question is, are you going to adapt or be the next one caught off guard like Netanyahu? If you agree that data sovereignty matters, don't just nod along, talk about it, share it, argue about it. Because whether you're in Ouagadougou or Ohio, the fight for control over your information has already started. The only choice left is which side of it you want to be on.